COVID-19 pandemic has been a monumental crisis, one that will probably echo across generations. But times of adversity, aren't they the best test of commitment, courage and character? Against an enemy that is invisible, ever present and always unforgiving, how did India manage a response that no one expected? Namaskar and welcome to New India Junction. I am Richa Dwivedi and this is The Bottom Line. What is the kind of leadership that a crisis needs? What is the kind of leadership India displayed? It can be broken down into 5 distinct strands. First, the leadership should have the ability to be empathetic and humane, but that wouldn't be enough. Any response is as strong as its weakest link. For any society, economically weaker sections are often the most vulnerable when it comes to global disease outbreaks. A study shows that during the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918, highest cumulative death rates were for Kenya at 5.78, India at 5.22, Guatemala at 3.92 and Madagascar at 3.50. All 4 were impoverished. Comparatively, the same study puts death rates during Spanish flu for the USA, UK, France and Germany at 0.52, 0.46, 0.74 and 0.78 respectively. During a time when economic activity ground to a halt, what do you think would be the primary concern for the economically weak? Easy answer: food. And as it just so happens, the government of India announced free food grains for 80 crore people for months together. This happened on March 26, 2020, just 3 days after the lockdown was announced. Next, without economic activity and with the lockdown in place, getting home to their families would be the need, correct? Between May and August 2020, over 6.3 million migrant laborers made their way home on board the Shramik special trains. They too were given food packets and water bottles to make the summer heat bearable. And talking of getting home, did you know that by March 2021, a total of 6.75 million people had been repatriated from various countries under the Vande Bharat mission? Apart from these massive feats, what we saw during the COVID-19 crisis was a whole of government approach, from central government ministers to respective departments and from state governments to local district administration and all the way down to the teams on the ground. Everyone was at it. An example was seen in the rupees 20 trillion, almost $300 billion Atmanirbhar Bharat package, which addressed the concerns of many diverse sectors. Now that a lot of people were back home, they lacked employment, but the nation was still in a lockdown. They needed cash, right? Rupees 500 was transferred for 3 months to a massive 20.64 crore, more than 200 million women Jan Dhan account holders. Then rupees 1,000 in 2 installments to 28.2 billion old, widowed and specially abled beneficiaries. The wages for the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme MNREGA were hiked. In addition, the Garib Kalyan Rozgar Abhiyan launched by Prime Minister Modi generated a total of 507.8 million person days of work. Yet, there are some who still ask the question, how is India managing an economic recovery? It's simple, the weakest sections were protected. But all this, that doesn't stop the pandemic from spreading, correct? How can someone mobilize a collective effort from 1.3 billion people against COVID-19? Here comes the next strand. The leadership should be proactive and decisive. Preparing to the best of our ability before the worst is upon us is how we made a difference. Do you remember when the WHO was alerted regarding COVID-19 by China? January 7, 2020. Just 1 day later, on January 8, 2020, India's Ministry of Health and Family Welfare held a joint monitoring session meeting. India had no cases back then, and still the government took it seriously. But that wasn't all. On January 17th, the ministry issued an advisory to all states and on same day began screening passengers at the airports of Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Kolkata, Bengaluru, Hyderabad and Kochi. This was before almost anyone else in the world was doing this. A total of 9,153 passengers on 43 flights had been scanned by January 21. India still had no cases. On January 25th, the Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister held a review meeting, and by January 29th, realizing the necessity of safety equipment, India restricted the export of PPE kits and N95 masks. Travel advisories were issued relating to China again, before almost anyone else in the world. Remember, the WHO hadn't even mandated masks yet. On the January 30th, when India registered its first confirmed case of COVID-19, 6 labs had already been identified and activated for testing. By February 3rd, 2020, even as India had reported just 3 cases, Prime Minister Modi constituted a high-level group of ministers to review management of COVID-19. March 2020, Holi was just round the corner. Prime Minister Modi voluntarily abstained from attending any Holi gatherings to maintain social distancing. He even appeared with a face cover in official meetings to set the right precedent. This is where leadership makes a difference. On March 11th, the WHO declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. March 22nd was when India observed a voluntary curfew, the Janta or People's Curfew, on just a mere call by Prime Minister Modi.
22 मार्च रविवार को सुबह 7 बजे से रात 9 बजे तक सभी देशवासियों को जनता कर्फ्यू का पालन करना है.
This is the maturity of millennia-old culture. At one call from their leader, the entire nation understood that this was something much bigger than just their life. The claps that echoed across the country ensured that even our brave corona warriors did not feel that they were alone. India understood.
When a strict nationwide lockdown was announced, India understood that it was necessary. At this point of time, India had just 562 cases.
Similarly, on April 5th, when the entire nation went dark only to be illuminated by the lamps that a billion Indians lit together at the stroke of 9 p.m., the same belief was reaffirmed. That night, every Indian knew that the fight would be long and hard, but that they were not alone. The lockdown, the trust that people had in their leadership, and the belief that the best possible course of action was being taken ensured once again that we as a people understood. The measures also worked because the leadership taking the decisions was rooted in ground reality and not acting in theoretical vacuum. No restrictions were ever placed on agricultural activity, or India's villages were never locked down. Result? There was never any economic distress, and the villages kept the cities running with adequate supplies even when they were under lockdown. Talk about foresight. Systematic unlocks allowed the economy to gradually open up and safeguarded the Indian population against another major outbreak. In fact, be it chief ministers, pharma companies, or even journalists and sportspersons, Prime Minister Modi has held close to 75 meetings on COVID-19. This short summary of proactiveness in the early days of the pandemic is just to offer a glimpse of how India was proactive at every stage of the pandemic curve. In the beginning, during the first wave, in between the first and second wave, during the second wave, and then beyond. Which brings us to the third and possibly the most important strand of a nation's defense: the need for adequate healthcare infrastructure. In January 2020, India had one single lab to run COVID-19 tests. Within a year, that number had increased to 2,294. By May 2021, 2,504 labs were conducting tests across the country. In January 2020, India conducted 50 COVID-19 tests, 1 million by August 2020, 100 million by October 2020. As of September 8, 2021, India had tested over 500 million samples. India and its scientific community was very quick to realize the shortfall in capacity of RT-PCR tests. But we started using rapid antigen tests as early as April 4, 2020. This was long before WHO recommended it. we were thinking on our feet. In less than a year, India had over 20,000 dedicated COVID facilities, over 1.8 million isolation beds without oxygen, a ramp up from just over 10,000 before pandemic, over 270,000 isolation beds with oxygen support, over 92,000 ICU beds, including 40,000 equipped with ventilators, a ramp up from just 2,000 a year ago. In less than a year, we had also started over 12,000 quarantine centers with close to 600,000 beds. It took India over 70 years to equip about 16,000 beds with ventilators, and in just 9 months from March till December 2020, an additional 36,433 ventilators were supplied to government hospitals, all of them made in India. Don't you find it strange that in less than a year, between April to December 2020, for a nation that barely produced any such equipment, that too only for export, to manufacture 60 million PPE kits and 150 million N95 masks came almost naturally? These are our inherited values. When we witnessed fights on something as trivial as toilet paper in other countries, Indians were coming together in the time of crisis. Voluntary contributions poured in to the PM CARES Fund, which was used to supply ventilators and fund PSA plans. And the results were soon before us. It came as no surprise that when India needed it the most, the government announced setting up of over 1,200 additional oxygen generating plants across the country. The PM CARES for Children scheme, launched for children orphaned due to the pandemic, is another example. Not just that, where India only produced about 900 metric tons of liquid oxygen in a day in 2019, a total of 9,446 metric tons a day was being produced in May 2021. That is a 10-fold jump within a year. This is why we saw thousands of tons of oxygen transported aboard the Oxygen Express and also the Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy. This brings us to the fourth strand. What any good leadership should have is the ability to push boundaries and a vision. The world's largest vaccination drive. Again, let me remind you, WHO notified COVID-19 as pandemic only in March 2020. By April 2020, India had constituted a task force for conducting research on COVID-19 vaccines. In just a month after learning about a pandemic, India was looking for a way to defeat it. Why the hurry? How about an example? The polio vaccine was developed in 1955, but India was declared polio-free only in 2014. That's more than half a century. But this is a different India. The Prime Minister himself was in regular touch with vaccine manufacturers. He traveled to manufacturing units to personally take stock of the progress. Red tape was cut to fast-track approvals while keeping all scientific rigor in place, and financial assistance was offered to all manufacturers who were showing signs of making progress. Many mocked this proactive approach and doubted India's capacity. But in January this year, when India began the world's largest vaccination drive, the first recipient was a sanitation worker. And to throw things into perspective, let us for a second consider the total populations of the USA, UK, Germany, France, Russia, and Australia. A rough estimate is 722 million.
As of today, India has administered 771.65 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine.
Interestingly, over 99% of these doses are with vaccines manufactured right here in India. Here is another statistic. In August 2021, India alone administered more doses than the entire G7 countries combined. India's current average daily doses administered is more than the combined total of European Union, the Arab League, and the ASEAN, and without any mandate or coercion, purely voluntarily. But it is not just about vaccine production, is it? It is as much about logistics, is it not? From the factory to reaching down to almost 50,000 centers administering the doses in the remotest corners of the country and marinating the cold chain all through. And to be able to do this and still administer almost 10 million doses a day. That is the feat that India has displayed. Again, voluntarily by coming together. No one got undue preference when it came to vaccinations. Even the Prime Minister himself got his jab only when he was eligible. But by watching the leader get a Made in India vaccine, that too with a smile on his face, millions were inspired to take the shot. Imagine if Indians didn't produce their own vaccines, what would have happened? So-called developed countries even refused to share vaccine raw material, let alone vaccines. And last, but certainly not the least, the will to share. India sent 400 million tablets of hydroxychloroquine to 114 nations, 96 million tablets of paracetamol to 24 nations, not to mention the PPE kits and safety equipment. Over 66 million doses of Made in India vaccines were shared with as many as 95 countries, especially those with negligible or no production capacities. Technology for India's very own COVID registration portal is to be shared with 50 countries free of cost. Why? Why is that? Simply put, because India understands. We've been neglected and pushed down the order in the past, but it is our culture that has enabled us to move past it, to become self-reliant, to ensure that no one is pushed down, that all are treated equally and in all fairness. But India's COVID story is not just that, which brings us to the final, but perhaps the one with longest lasting impact, the fifth strand of future planning. Even in the middle of the pandemic, decision-making was not paralyzed. Multi-sectoral economic reforms from labor to ports, from agriculture to manufacturing, from defense to drone policy, from taxation reforms to coal licensing, from MSMEs to announcing a plan for more than $1 trillion investment on infrastructure creation, the policy framework was kept alive and kicking, which has afforded India to effect a quick turnaround as the latest quarterly GDP results bear testimony. The difference between nations that have been reeling under COVID-19 and India's relative success in saving lives is just one: leadership of Prime Minister Modi that was proactive in protecting the vulnerable, took decisions ahead of the curve and knew what the nation needed. Would the nation have come together if someone else other than Prime Minister Modi was there? You decide.